Hey everyone. So I'm going to be talking about Jakarta Persistence 3.2. And the first comment I have to make about it is that JPA 4 is coming, but this isn't it. So what that means for us is that Persistence 3.2 is all about incremental improvements and smoothing off some rough edges. Now it turns out that there were plenty of rough edges, and so this is actually a big release, even though it doesn't contain very many, major new features. It contains lots of little features. And that makes it a kind of a hard presentation to do because it's hard to boil a release like that down to major themes. For example, like a whole lot of work has gone into, improving the Java doc, making the specification clearer and more readable. And that kind of work doesn't really make for a fun presentation, even though it's important. But today I'll focus on kind of three themes, which I do think are running through a lot of the changes. The first is type safety, programmatic control, and also improvements to the query language. So why is type safety important to me? Type safety is like, I think I hold very dear. Type safety is really all about developer productivity. It's the best way to make us more productive because it helps us find mistakes faster. And I think, really you'll find that in some other programming language communities, there's a lack of an appreciation of that. There's a lack of an appreciation that my productivity as a developer is all about me spending my time doing programming, fixing bugs, rather than waiting for the test suite to stop running so that I know whether there's a bug or not. So one of the great advantages of Java is that it is a relatively type-safe language. The second theme is programmatic control. Now, traditionally, Java EE had or did focus a lot on configuration, especially configuration external to the code in XML. I'm thinking back, 20 years. Nowadays, we've moved to a great extent, a long time ago, we moved to using annotations. But even so, there's, kind of still an emphasis on declarative programming in Jakarta EE. And we would like to introduce partly because that makes it easier to write tests. Finally, I'm going to talk about JPQL. And one of the reasons JPQL is important is because a subset of JPQL is now being relabeled Jakarta Data Query Language, and it's core to Jakarta Data. So let's start talking about programmatic control and how that simplifies testing. The first element of this is the new persistence configuration class. And that is a builder, which lets you specify configuration properties, lets you specify the entity classes and embeddable classes in your persistence unit, and create an entity manager factory, right? So it lets you bootstrap Jakarta persistence without the need for persistence.xml file, without the need for a container in code, which is very useful in testing. And secondly, it also contains some static members with the names of standardized configuration properties. As you can see, they're like lock timeout. Now, one of the things we've done in the spec is we've blessed the idea that we encourage implementations to extend persistence configuration with vendor-specific subclasses, like, for example, for our product, Hibernate Persistence Configuration, which then let you specify vendor-specific properties using in a type-safe way. And secondly, override the return type of create energy manager factory, so that in Hibernate, for example, this will return a session factory, which is our subtype of entity manager factory. So this is, starting to embrace the idea that implementations do extend JPA with additional functionality. The second element is Schema Manager, and this is a really simple interface with just four methods on it. The first one lets you export the schema that is inferred from your entity classes to the database. Very important in testing. And clean up the schema afterwards by dropping all the objects which have been exported. It lets you validate the schema in the database. This is something that people do use at testing. It is a kind of test of your schema, especially if your schema is managed externally to the JPA provider in your own scripts, which is very common. But some people even like to validate the schema when their application starts up. And finally, the new operation, which is called truncate. And the purpose of the truncate operation is just to clean up all the data, drop all the rows of all the schema, which are all the tables which are mapped by entities in the persistence unit, without dropping the database objects themselves. And the advantage of this is to enable, much faster testing on some databases. So this is actually important, a quite important improvement. Continuing on the theme of making it easy to test, and we have added operations calling transaction and running transaction. These are we're missing a C there, and these operations are something which have been missing for a long time. They just let you pass in an operation to perform as an anonymous function, as a lambda, and this operation automatically does transaction and exception handling for you. Again, not so much of a big deal if you're running in a JakartaE environment where the container is managing transactions, managing a persistence context for you, probably, that you just inject, but very useful in tests. In addition, for a similar reason, we've added call with connection and run with connection to the entity manager API. And the purpose of this is to make it a little bit easier to just execute direct JDBC in rare cases where you do need to do that. Okay. So the second theme I'm going to talk about here is type safety, and in particular, the static metamodel. So the static metamodel has an interesting history. I originally proposed this 15 years ago or something as a way to make the criteria API, which the JPA2 expert group was designing at the time, as a way to make it type safe. So you would be able to pass in references to attributes of your entities in a type safe way, rather than just passing in names as strings. And I think, it would be fair to say that, the criteria API and this aspect of the criteria API was not really well loved at the time. Criteria API was not viewed as a success. I certainly didn't view it as a success. It tended to be verbose and difficult to work with. Now, more recently, we've had cause to reevaluate that judgment. It turns out that especially with the addition of local type inference to Java, a lot of the pain of writing these very long verbose generic types is gone. Support for annotation processes in development environments and build systems has improved a lot. And so I really think there's the passage of time has been kind to this idea, and it turns out to be really powerful. Now I want to kind of make a couple of comments here. I think that annotation processing has a bad rep in some corners, and I see specific reasons for that. Annotation processing is a sharp knife, right? It's something, like many powerful features of a programming language, it's the kind of thing which can be used in a bad way and which can cause lots of problems, or it's something which can be used in a good way and result in a lot of elegance. So, there's a lot of, it's a case where we need to be careful. And I don't think, I want to say that just because you've had some bad experiences with some annotation processes in the past doesn't mean that you will necessarily have a bad experience with the use of the static metamodel with the annotation processor in Jakarta Persistence, or the much more powerful one that's in our implementation of Jakarta Data. So let's see what this does for us in JPA. There's a lot more in Jakarta Data, but I'm not talking about that in this presentation. So first of all, one of the things that's bothered me for forever in the annotation-based mappings in Jakarta Persistence is this mapped by annotation, this mapped by member, where you have to refer to an attribute of the entity at the other end of a many-to-one or many-to-many, one-to-many or many-to-many association. Now, as of JPA 3.2, we will generate names, string-based names of the attributes of the author class into the author underscore static metamodel class, allowing you to now refer to attributes of entities in a somewhat type-safe way, as you can see there on this slide. Even kind of cooler than that, if we consider things like named queries and named entity graphs, which I've shown on the example in this slide, you can see that we have these stringly type names. Okay, so I've never much liked this. I don't like string-based references between different program elements, and so in JPA 3.2, we found a solution to that, which was to generate a reference to, here we see a named query, into the static metamodel for the class that the named query annotation appears on. So here we can see the book underscore text for ISBN is which represents the named query itself. And it's not just the name, so this is a string-based name, because you can see that it's aware of the type of thing returned by the query. And so when I just call create query, pass in the reference, set a parameter, get single result, I'm returned a string. Now, this is a complete solution to type safety for queries in Jakarta Persistence, because you can see that I still have this parameter binding, which is not completely type safe. We have no way to infer the parameter type of that named query. If you really want full type safety, then you're going to have to go and take a look at Jakarta Data, where we found a solution that's even more powerful, even more type safe than what we have here. We have a similar thing for named entity graphs. Here's a type-safe reference to a named entity graph that we just find in annotations. Once again, we don't have to pass in book.class to the find method. We just pass in the reference to the graph, and the return type is automatically inferred. Now, as of JPA 3.2, I want to say I don't love the annotations for defining named entity graphs. And so my recommendation as of today is to use the entity graph API to create the entity graph in code, in executable code. Once again, this is completely type safe to do it this way. In JPA 4, I am proposing that we improve the annotations to something that would be more elegant. The next aspect of type safety has nothing to do with the static meta model. It's the introduction of find option and some friends we'll see in a second. So what's a find option? Well, previously in up to JPA 3.1, if you wanted to pass some optional information about how the entity manager should go about finding an entity, retrieving an entity by primary key value, the way to do that was to pass in a map object with some strings associated with some values, and it was all verbose and horrible and not type safe at all. And this is a much better way. So in JPA 3.2, a number of constructs like lock mode type and cache store mode now implement this interface called find options. And the find method accepts var args of find options. We've even introduced several other classes like timeout, for example, where timeout also implements find options. And so you can pass in options like the lock mode, how you want to lock the entity when you load it, how long it should wait before timing out, how you want to interact with the second level cache during that operation in a type safe form. And there's a similar thing for the refresh operation, for the lock operation, and they also have their own options. Now, this is once again designed for extension by implementation. So, of course, implementations of JPA like Hibernate or Eclipse Link have their own options. And previously those were passed in with these stringly type names, and it was horrible. Now, the implementations of Jakarta persistence can provide their own implementations of find options or refresh options or lock options. Excuse me, it's find option, refresh option, lock option, not plural. And pass those into the find operation. The next thing is the query language. So in JPA 3.2, we did not add major new features to the query language. We mostly standardized a few things which were already supported by implementations like Hibernate and Eclipse Link and other implementations. Excuse me. So let's see what those things were. First of all, and this was something we added very much because it was something that was needed by Jakarta Data. And as I said, Jakarta Data has a query language. It's a subset of JPQL. Is a streamlined syntax for very simple queries where you're just querying one entity, right? So if I only have the book entity in my query, asking me to, say select book from book where book dot title like pattern is just a bit verbose and unnecessary. And even SQL lets you abbreviate such queries. So Hibernate has let you do this kind of abbreviation for forever. And now the specification blesses that. So you can see the select clause is now optional if you're just retrieving one entity. If there's one entity in query, you just want to retrieve that. No need to write select or select book. The aliases are optional. So title implicitly refers to an attribute of book because there's only one entity there. It's the only thing it could possibly refer to. If there's a need to refer to the entity that doesn't have an alias, you can use this keyword, right? So that's an implicit alias for an entity with no alias. We have introduced union intersect. This was, a very, very ancient request. So now you can do the same thing you can do with SQL with union intersect. We have introduced ad hoc joins. This is something which, again, the implementations have supported it for a long time. You guys have probably used it. Nothing very exciting here, but the spec now says that implementations have to support it. So an ad hoc join is a join where you specify the join condition rather than being based on an association, but that exists in Java that's mapped one-to-many association in the entity model in Java. We've also added a few new functions. In JPA 3.1, we already added a bunch of new functions, but in 3.2, we added a couple more. One is the cast function. So we can cast a thing to integer or string or a couple of other types. It has quite limited set of types because the semantics of the cast operation are quite difficult to get portable across databases. Obviously, we expect that implementations like Hibernate will support a larger range of cast types, but what's required in the spec is fairly minimal. You can see the left operation for just, which is a common function, dialects of SQL, that is now required. We have finally a concatenation operator. Obviously, JPQL has already had always had the concat function, but for some reason it never allowed you to write concatenation with the double bar operator from SQL. And finally, we allow more flexible ordering conditions in the order by clause. Again, this is something, once again, implementations would let you do lots of things that that the spec didn't require, and now that will be portable. Another thing that we have been pressured into do it. I must admit that I at first was a little skeptical that was worth doing or necessary to do, but I've realized that, no, that the people advocating for this were right and I was wrong, is um, um, enhanced integration with CDI. Now, Jakarta Persistence was always integrated with CDI, right from the start. Um, and there was always a way to inject persistence context via CDI annotations. However, most of the community, have always used the persistence context annotation, the persistence unit annotation to inject the entity manager or the entity manager factory, and that was fine. But I understand the desire to do everything through CDI, and as the creator of CDI, I'm that warms my heart to hear that, right? So what can you do now? You can inject an entity manager or an entity manager factory with just the CDI inject annotation. Not only that, but you can also inject some of the other constructs which are important, which are useful, like criteria builder, cache, metamodel, schema manager, and persistence unit util, rather than having to go to the entity manager factory to get a reference to these things. For example, in a typical little, I don't know, JAX-RS endpoint or something like that, you wouldn't need to inject the entity manager factory, but might want to inject the criteria builder. So that's just it's like a kind of a trivial reduction in verbosity, but it's quite nice. Now, obviously, your question is going to be, well, what if I have more than one persistence unit in my program, which is not unusual at all? And the answer is that you can specify in persistence.xml CDI qualifiers, even CDI scopes, the CDI qualifier annotation. You can say that this persistence unit is identified by the @library CDI qualifier annotation. And now if you use that qualifier annotation on your injection point, that is the persistence unit whose entity manager will be injected. So let's talk now a little bit about what's coming. Obviously, I'm very focused right now on JPA4, and the current status of JPA4 is that we have a lot of proposals, a lot of open pull requests. We have not pulled the trigger on anything so far. We're still discussing these things, so I don't want to talk too much and promise and overpromise, too many things that we may not ultimately decide to do. But I do want to tell you about a couple of things that I think are important, and I think there is I think are well socialized, and there's good agreement that we should do them. So the first thing is Jakarta Query. Now, what's Jakarta Query? It may be for many of you people the first time you're hearing about it. So the idea here, the impetus behind this is that Jakarta, as I said, I think twice already, Jakarta Data has a query language called JDQL, very imaginative on our part. And what it is it's a subset of JPQL. And we want to keep it that way. We want one query language in the Jakarta ecosystem, not multiple. In fact, we want one query language in one object query language in the Java ecosystem. And so, there's currently we've been managing in the unholy sprint to get Jakarta Data finished according to the timelines that were imposed on us. There was a lot of back and forth that went on between the persistence group and the data group to say, hey, well, we need to add these little things into JPQL because from the perspective of JDQL, they're needed. One example is the simplified querying I mentioned before without the need for aliases. JDQL, because it's targeting lots of different kinds of data stores, we don't require that you be able to query multiple entities. So when you have a query language, which is really, assuming that there's one root entity in a query, having aliases doesn't make sense. That's just an example of how there needs to be this back and forth between the definitions of JPQL and JDQL. Now, on the other hand, Jakarta Data shouldn't become dependent upon Jakarta Persistence because, as I said, Jakarta Data is targeting a range of data stores. So I think that makes it, to me, that makes it clear that Jakarta query should be its own thing, that the query language needs its own spec, and that this should be maintained as a new top level Jakarta project. So this is being proposed, and it's not approved yet, but we hope, and there's support for this on at least on both sides of persistence in Jakarta. The next thing is the thing we've been waiting years for, I guess, which is I'm currently calling it entity agent. If there is great hate for that name, well, we'll have to revisit that. What's an entity agent? Well, we had an entity manager, right? Now, we want something that's a little more hands-off than a manager. So what's a little less hands-on than a manager? What is a little bit less overbearing than a manager? Well, an agent. So an entity agent is the equivalent of this thing we've had in Hibernate for many years called stateless session. And it's a thing that I think, I feel, one of the big regrets I've had is that we were very slow and very late to recognize the importance of this thing. I think a lot of people who struggle with ORM, with object relational mapping, and who've struggled with JPA over the years would have been much happier with a programming model which works more like what you would get if you wrote some, say JDBC code by hand. That is a programming model where you say, update the database, delete this thing from the database, where entity objects aren't managed objects under the control of the persistence context, where there's no automatic dirty checking and implicit update, so that update is like this, this explicit operation where you call a method to send an update statement to the database, where there's none of this asynchronous behavior where I make changes via the persistence context, and then those changes are synchronized to the database, when the persistence context flushes, which might be at the end of the transaction, for example, or just before, or before running a query. So there's all this kind of implicit asynchronous behavior that goes on in a stateful entity manager. That is great. Lots of people, it's developers, when they come looking for an ORM solution, that's what they want. That's what they're looking for. Okay, most, but not all. And even if that's most often the most convenient thing, there are certainly times when that's inconvenient. So stateless session is the answer to that, and I think it should have been part of JPA from the start. I think it was a mistake that it wasn't. And I share just more in that shame than anybody else. So we're finally going to do it. In fact, this is already planned as the most important new feature of JPA4. But Jakarta data makes this need even more acute because Jakarta data repositories are stateless in this sense of statelessness. So a Jakarta data repository that's backed by a Jakarta persistence provider actually needs, there's no clean way to do that as of today. This was a difficult call to make in the design of Jakarta data, was to realize that as of Jakarta data 1.0 and Jakarta persistence 3.2, there was no clean way to implement Jakarta data repository in terms of a Jakarta persistence entity manager. And so, for example, in our implementation in Hibernate, our Jakarta data, Hibernate data repositories implementation of Jakarta data calls internal API, well, not internal, excuse me, they're public APIs, but they're Hibernate APIs rather than Jakarta APIs. And that's, that's fine, it's tolerable, but it's not perfect. We would like you to be able to implement Jakarta data purely in terms of APIs that are public and standard within Jakarta persistence. Okay, so the most acute need there is for a stateless entity manager, entity agent, let's call it, and anything else we discover like that, I think that needs to be the goal going forward, as we're, working on Jakarta data 1.1 and future and on JPA 4. Okay, now if you go to the Jakarta Persistence Project right now, you're going to see a whole lot of candidates to be part of 4. As I said, there's about 33 open pull requests with potential, proposed features of JPA 4. It would be great to get feedback from the community about these things, and leave your suggestions about how we should go about doing these things. Okay, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, now is your chance. Come on, folks, don't leave me hanging like this. Here we go. No questions? Okay, so we have a question as to when will Jakarta Persistence 3.2 be available in Hibernate. It's available now already. In a beta release. So Hibernate 7 is now in beta 2, I believe, but beta 3 is either, I don't know, I think it was supposed to go out this week, but I don't think that happened. Anyway, the point is that we have already implemented it, and we are in the last stages of finalizing that implementation in Hibernate, and Hibernate 7 is just around the corner. I shouldn't, spend my time promoting Hibernate 7 here, but it will have Jakarta Persistence 3.2. And you can try it out today. The plans for the next Jakarta Persistence release. So, I don't want to go beyond my talk about things which I don't have the right to talk about. I'm doing this talk filling in for Lucas, who leads the Persistence project. I believe, in our discussions that we've had, I believe that we would like to see a JPA 4 specification in the year that's coming. Our goal is not to wait for again, I'm speaking beyond what I can really say with certainty, but our thoughts are that we shouldn't wait for the platform 12 release for JPA 4. So JPA 3.2 is part of 11, and JPA 4 will probably 4.0 will also target 11, but won't be part of platform 11. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so JPA 4 will be coming sooner rather than later. That's our goal. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. And I hope that was interesting. Okay, goodbye.